Golden Dawn, and especially unlike those who felt called to the ministry, he was a nonconformist. He was a sort of Congregationalist, and he was odd in that respect as he was odd in others. But it does lead me to the last of the talks, which is on the clergy of the Golden Dawn, and there were rather more of them than you might think, and they were in some ways rather more curious than you might think. We shall hear about them from the Reverend Kevin Tingey, who manages to combine, although I hope he doesn't mind my saying so, the combination, which Francis equally might find odd, of being a cleric and an occultist, although he'd no doubt repudiate the term occultist. He has had long experience of all this kind of thing. He has long been interested in esoteric things. He is very knowledgeable about them, and he has that excellent quality of having been a bookseller and having given it up and become a book collector. Thus he has ceased to be a rival and become a customer. But I will now let him talk.
As always with introductions, they sometimes turn out to be more exciting than that which follows. And I think I'd offer this paper as a sort of, perhaps as a warning to students, and perhaps also a help to them, that there are an awful lot of blind alleys in looking at the influence of the Golden Dawn. And in Bob's talk, he showed how some of these alleged influences are tenuous indeed. I suppose there was a certain sort of professional interest in looking at these clerical members of the Golden Dawn. And the paper is based on an examination of those listed in Bob's companion and who had the Reverend written before their names. It may be that there were other people who, in that list, or indeed in other lists that have been lost, who were ordained. And if anyone has any information, I would be interested to receive it. I haven't included the Reverend A.F.A. Woodford, who, in a sense, is a precursor of the Golden Dawn, because he managed, as it were, his involvement culminated in his death in 1887, just as it were things were getting going 100 years ago. Now, the one person I'm not going to talk about is the major figure amongst my clerical brothers, and that, of course, is the Reverend W.R. Ayton, whose life and work has been charted by Elic Howe and quoted in our previous talk, and he needs no further comment from me. Elic has done all that needs to be done, unless we discover another cache of Ayton documents. Bob will probably find one next week, and I'll have a look at it. But I was intrigued by his personality and wondered what sort of men his fellow clerical initiates might be. Now, as you know, the Church of England has always had a tradition of priestly eccentrics and even occultists. I do repudiate the title of occultist. A student of occultism, maybe. An occultist, no. So I'd hoped to find some further fascinating characters, but sadly none of them have proved to be quite as engaging as Mr. Ayton. And so I'm sorry if I've preempted any of you who are going to study the clergy of the Golden Dawn. You'll now have to go on to study the article clerks of the Golden Dawn, the local government officers of the Golden Dawn. There's a whole host of things. The thing about the clergy is, of course, is that they're more easily recognisable by their title, and their names appear in reference books. Now, there were 16 in the list. One of them was merely listed as the Reverend J. Rees, with no other information given which might enable one to pick him out from the flood of vocations of that name which I've discovered that the Principality has produced. So Welsh scholars may yet discover him. In back issues of Crockford, there are dozens. In fact, I think that most clergymen in the church in Wales are called the Reverend J. Rees, or have been. So sadly, he's another of these lost characters. Of the remaining 15, we can do slightly better. 13 of them are Anglican and 2 Congregationalist, interestingly enough. Now look at the Congregationalists first, because I'm sure you're perhaps even more interested in Congregationalists than you are in Anglicans. The first of those was the Reverend T. Travers Sherlock, who spent most of his ministry in Smethwick. And he didn't go further than neophyte grade and was listed as demitted in 1891, 3 years after his admission. He seems to have devoted most of his efforts to land reform and trade unionism and in local politics. One of his claims to fame is that he was one of the people elected unopposed to Staffordshire County Council on the formation of that body. But his esoteric interest, I think, may have continued because in his obituary, in the Congregational Yearbook, he was described as being widely read, philosophy being his favourite subject, and then rather cryptically, his mental attitude was broader than that of the average student. So what went on in Smethwick, whether alchemy or whatever, under the guise of the support of land reform and trade unionism, we probably will never know. The second Congregationalist, Will Reason, joined the Stella Matutina in 1906 and had progressed to the Adeptus Minor grade by 1908 and was described as the Cancellarius and instructor in healing in 1914. Like Sherlock, his prime interest seemed to be in social questions. That's not particularly unusual. The Congregational Church at that time was well known for its social concerns. From 1910 to 1920, he was secretary of the Social Services Committee of the Congregational Union, and from 1920 to 26, he was co-secretary with Bishop Gore of the Christian Social Crusade. Part of the literary heritage included his several books, which amongst whom were The Liquor Traffic as a National Problem, and similar titles, as well as improving tracts for children, such as 10-minute talks to boys and girls. But none of them, I haven't read any of them, certainly their titles don't hint of his membership of the order. I'm sure Bob will diligently search for those titles if you really want to look at them. Of the clergy of the established church, I've yet to discover anything to match the excitements of Mr. Ayton's alchemical cellar. Some did have interests of an esoteric nature. T.W. Lemon was a member of the SRIA, but didn't follow up his Golden Dawn initiation. And C.H. Malden, who spent the earlier part of his ministry in South India, edited the Madras Masonic Review. He published 2 Masonic books in Madras, and both of those were members of Isis Urania. The Reverend Fielding Ould, not Robert as he's listed, I think, for reasons of looking at what the real Robert did. I think there must have been some mistake in copying there. Seems to be a slightly more interesting figure. Originally surnamed plain Ould, he hyphenated his name at an early stage. After a number of curacies, he went to a first incumbency, but stayed there for less than a year at the turn of the century, after which there was a mysterious gap in Crockford's clerical directory until he takes up a curate's post again in 1906. Now, sometimes that means those gaps in Crockford that there was some embarrassing scandal. But it's interesting, of course, he may have been away on a magical retirement or whatever. I haven't been able to discover. Possibly, if I go on with this venture, which I'm not sure whether I will or not, I may discover in an obscure parish magazine an account of where he spent the early years of this century. He wrote 3 works on the relationship between Christianity and spiritualism, urging the Church to take notice of the positive contribution which he saw that movement making. And his books of sermons and meditations show his interest in the mystical. If anyone's interested, I've got all the books published by all of these people, such as they were listed, but I'm not going to read them out to you. In the 1920s, he published several books of poetry. He was initiated into the Stella Matutina in March 1909. He became vicar of Christ Church, Albany Street, which is just across the park there, in 1915, in the same year in which A.H. Lee left that church, having served there 5 years as a curate. So we have a Golden Dawn connection a stone's throw from here, and whether there was a connection between the 2 men, whether they were friends or not, we are not quite sure. The Reverend William Farquhar resigned from Isis Urania in 1892 and went on to serve a long ministry as Vicar of Hanwell in Middlesex. I can discover nothing interesting to say about him, except that one of his successors was Harry Seacombe's brother. That's as Vicar of Hanwell. Of the other SM members, the Reverend Boosfield Swan Lombard, who was Vicar of All Hallows, North St Pancras, left soon after his initiation in 1907 to serve as chaplain to the English Church in St Petersburg. He held that post until 1918, when some other events there seem to have precipitated his return to the no doubt calmer fields of rural Herefordshire. Now, Bob drew my attention yesterday to something. It's always the problem with papers, is that you come to something and then Bob Gilbert tells you something and you've got to rush off and check it. To a reference to Mr. Lombard in Nestor Webster's book that he's already quoted, Secret Societies and Subversive Movements, which is full of nonsense from beginning to end. And he said, I can't remember the page as a reference, so fortunately I found it in about 2 minutes, but rummaging through my copy of that book. She quotes him not writing to her, but writing to Lord Curzon about events during the Russian Revolution in a government paper on the revolution. And she was quoting him, unusually for Nestor Webster, was quoting something that actually had some truth in it, of the German involvement in the Russian Revolution. The fascinating thing is, of course, is most of the book is suggesting that the Golden Dawn and other organisations were behind the Russian Revolution or the German influence on the Russian Revolution. She would no doubt have been horrified that the person she thought was quoting as being an impeccable source, namely the Anglican chaplain in St Petersburg, in fact had been a member. But no doubt she spins in her grave, as I suspect she constantly does anyway. Mr. Lombard, no doubt shattered from his experiences there, got an OBE for it in 1920, and ended his career in what we hope was the restful post of chaplain to the Mount Tabor convent in Basingstoke, where he survived until 1948. It's very interesting, sometimes looking at these figures, clergymen, of course, are notoriously long-lived. Something which seems historically remote suddenly comes into your own lifetime, and you realise that things are perhaps closer than you thought. James Charles Fitzgerald was, of all things, a mission priest of the Community of the Resurrection at Mirfield, but found time to progress after his initiation in 1908 to be instructor in ceremonial. As you know, the community at Mirfield is terribly high church. No doubt he would be an expert in ceremonial. He collaborated in a book on contemplative prayer in 1915. Until I pay a visit to Mirfield and look through their records and even the Havney, I haven't found out much more about him. Alban Henry Baverstock also joined the SM when serving as rector of Hinton Marvel in Wiltshire. In fact, he became well known as an author on liturgical and pastoral subjects. So perhaps part of some of which are very well known and continue to be sought after by people who deal with second-hand booksellers. Francis Heasel, who was initiated in 1909, was rector of Letchworth at that time. Letchworth, of course, was the first garden city, and it was a focus for many progressive activities. A number of Theosophists were involved in the planning of that. In another capacity, I'm looking at preparing a paper on the social impact of the Theosophical movement. And it's very interesting how a number of these progressive social causes were espoused by people who had links with the Theosophical movement. And as Bob has touched on, there's this overlap of interests between a number of things, and therefore the links can't be precisely made. However, Mr. Heasel, he went on in 1918 to become vicar of the Church of St Michael and All Angels in Croydon. He remained there until 1951. We don't find any signs in his later ministry of his interest in the occult or anything that might be of particular interest to Golden Dawn students. His only obvious listed extra-parochial interest was in missionary work in Syria, serving as secretary to the Archbishop's Assyrian mission. And he wrote, drawing out of that definitive little work, The Woes of a Distressed Nation, being an account of the Assyrian people from 1914 to 1934. Yes, the general area of the Middle East, they were all, of course, colonial powers at that time. If you want to read all about it, you better find The Woes of a Distressed Nation. Bob will find it for you. The other two SM members were John Stewart, who ministered mainly in Essex, and Lawrence Collingwood Hamerton, who had a living at Ashbury in Devon and then at Upper Beeding in Sussex. 3 priests were members of Waite's Independent and Rectified Rite. Basil Lester spent most of his ministry as vicar of Woodville in Peterborough and spent a long retirement in Worthing. Another of these strange coincidences, one of his retirement addresses was in a parish where I previously served. I haven't checked there whether he left enigmatic objects in the attic or documents with his landlady. Arthur Hugh Evelyn Lee, as Bob has mentioned already, he was... with D.H. Nicholson, edited the Oxford Book of English Mystical Verse, which appeared in 1916. In 1926, he produced a book of meditations for Passiontide entitled The Wisdom of the Cross. And in 1927, he published a translation of de Sennevoy's Magnetism and Magic. He was vicar of St. Martin's, Kensal Rise in London from 1926 until the late 1940s. His initiation into Waite's group took place in 1908, the year he left a curacy at Emmanuel Church, Leeds. And then there was a gap before he took another curacy at Christ Church, Albany Street in 1910, as already mentioned. Alfred Amos Fletcher Lamplugh served curacies in the north, in London and in Kent. From 1928 to 1948, he was vicar of Beckersbourne, or Bexbourne. Not being a man of Kent or a Kentish man, I'm not sure which way to pronounce it. Anyway, Beckersbourne, which was not far from Bishopsbourne, where A.E. Waite also went in 1928 to live in White Cottage. There's no mention of Mr. Lamplugh in Waite's autobiography, nor in his diaries of the period. So it's rather sad to reflect that these two old acquaintances lived within a few miles of one another without knowing of the fact. Watkins published Lamplugh's Some Aspects of Mysticism in Islam in 1915, and Lamplugh edited a translation of A Gnosis of Light, a translation of the untitled Apocalypse contained in the Codex Brucianus, which he was published in 1918. Not every avenue of research has been followed up, but I think it's most unlikely that anything of great significance or interest to students of the Golden Dawn tradition will emerge from the lives of these men. Some remain almost unknown quantities. Others have made minor contributions to the literature of religion. Most seem to have exercised caring ministries to ordinary people, and showing in that healing aspect of the Rosicrucian tradition, which is almost entirely forgotten by most of its more recent devotees. I've not been able to discover what prompted these men to join the order, or indeed to leave it. Its influence is apparent in the later activities of as a few of them, as I have shown. But their influence on the order was no doubt to reinforce the middle-class respectability that so characterized so much of its membership. If anyone were interested in the extremely boring details of what some of these things that these people wrote on the parishes in which they served, I'd be happy to communicate that with them afterwards. I think, therefore, all I can say is that I've hope successfully prevented any of you from wasting your time by following up this particular avenue of research.